Thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to talk about music and the human experience. This might be a different title than what you see on the pamphlet because it's a bit tricky to translate. But I'm basically going to give my take on what music is and why it's important. And hopefully you'll kind of see the world and you'll see music in a slightly different way. It's probably something different than what you're usually exposed to through your education. So it has some backgrounds. I have a degree in philosophy and psychology, and then I have a master's in neuroscience. I'm going to talk about philosophy, I'm going to talk about psychology. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit about religion. I usually try to stay clear of religion because, number one, it's very complicated, and number two, I don't have formal training on it, and I'm not as well read. So I think it's usually good to stick with philosophy and psychology, but usually when you stick with science, you get into a roadblock very quickly. There's only so deep that you can go. Then you have to switch to philosophy, and then you have the same problem, and then you have to go to religion. And also, how I'm going to give kind of this talk isn't going to be a very formal argument of point A to point B, but I'm more or less going to touch on several things, and I'm going to try to give you a rough idea of what I'm trying to convey here. And also, when I talk about music, I'm generally thinking about classical music to give some bit of context. So, it's roughly divided into 4 parts. Part number 1, nature of reality, something very simple. 2, theology, I'm going to talk about the sacred. I'm going to talk about music and the sacred. Then I'm going to talk about some neuroscience. I'm going to cover cognitive science again from a different perspective, and finally I'm going to end with a little bit of history. Kitarika has part 1 of giving you a little bit of context, so that what I'm saying in point 2 is a bit understandable to you, and then part 3 and part 4 are kind of like the validation of what I just said. So, what is reality? Very complicated question. This most straightforward way to think about it is to describe it in scientific terms, right? So the role of science is to explain what the world is, and it generally tries to do so in the sense of the world is objects, and let's try to find what those objects are and what they are made out of. The problem with this is that that's a very simplistic way of thinking. And usually what science tries to do is that it tries to reduce something to its components. So a chair is not actually a chair, but it's made out of a certain material, and the chair is made out of atoms, and it's mostly empty space. And so what science is usually trying to do is always seeking a lower level of explanation, and then it's saying that's what's truly real, and the higher phenomenon is actually not real at all. The problem with this perspective and this worldview that we inherited is that it has the risk of nihilism, which is basically thinking that there's no meaning in the world at all, which is a very reasonable perspective, because in the worldview of science, there's no such thing as meaning, and there's no such thing as values. There's no such thing as good or bad. Those are completely meaningless terms, and therefore nihilism is a pretty normal reaction to it, and a lot of people fall prey to it. So here's a quote from Camus. If I were a tree among trees, a cat among animals, this life would have a meaning, or rather this problem would have not arise. For I should belong to this world. I should be of this world which I am opposed to by my whole consciousness and my whole insistence upon familiarity. This ridiculous reason is what sets me in opposition to all creation. I cannot cross it out with a stroke of a pen. Now, Camus wasn't a nihilist, he was an absurdist, which is slightly different, but either way, the diagnostic of the problem is quite spot on. Basically, we are meaning creatures, and we're creatures of value, but then when we look at the world, we don't encounter meaning at all, and so it creates this gap. So now I'm just going to give some foundations of cognition, some ways that I think are pretty important to think about how we think and how we encounter the world. Number 1, you have very limited sensory perception. What you see of reality is only a very tiny slice. The most obvious way to think about this is the light spectrum. So there's a spectrum of light of wavelengths, and you only see what we have called visible light. And that's a very tiny part. So if what you were able to see from the spectrum of light would be increased by 300 times, you will only see still 1% of it. And vision is already your major sensory organ. Then also, all the processes of your cognition are mostly unconscious. So most of the time you're not aware of what you're thinking or how you're thinking at all. Almost everything is subconscious. And those two things are connected to what I'm saying here, the risk of combinatorial explosion, which is a very fancy word. But what it means is basically that it's a mathematical term of a consequence of complexity and exponentiality. So when something is very complex and when something is very exponential, it gets out of hand very, very quickly, and then it kind of breaks the system. And I'll try to give an example later on. And lastly, there's levels of abstraction to things, which is very important to understand. So I'm a human being, you're seeing me as a human being, but you can also see me as kind of a higher level of something lower, like the reductionism of science that I described. So you can see me as part biology, part physics, and so on and so forth. And it's not just material as well, so like there's a cultural component. So there's a personal aspect to me, so I have a personal history, I have memories, and so on and so forth. And there's also a societal element to it. So I'm embedded into a specific historical context, in a political context, I'm speaking English, which frames what I'm saying, and so on and so forth. And so it gets very, very complicated. And all of this is true, all at the same time. So that's the world that you should think about when you think about reality. But it's not the world of objects, it's way more complicated than that. So, in this image, raise your hands if the only thing that you see is snow and rocks. Okay? So, a few people only see snow and rocks, but quite a few people see something else. Exactly. So, there's some cows over there, and for the people that didn't initially pick up on the cows, now they saw it right away. Now, why didn't you see the cows before? They were there all along, right? And you picked up a pattern because of some association in your brain, because I pointed out to you, and because you know what the cow is, and then you kind of search through the image. But through the pixels, let's say, you then were able to extract a pattern out of it. And this type of thinking will be a bit important later on. Also, relative to the combinatorial explosion that I was talking about earlier, there's this very famous problem called the frame problem. And there's this famous experiment from AI researchers back in the 70s, and this was popularized by Dennett in the 90s. And it goes like this. There's that little robot over there, and the researchers basically codes the robot so that the robot needs to get to those batteries all the way there. And so there's a room, and then there's a wagon, and then there's some batteries, right? So the goal of the robot is to get batteries. So they deploy the robot goes in the world, tries to fetch the batteries. Oh, but there's a bomb, the bomb explodes, the robot dies, basically. And then the researchers are like, well, that didn't work out very well, so we need to improve the robot. Like, what was the issue here? And the issue was that the robot only had a primary goal in mind, which was the battery. It failed to consider other possibilities and other variables that might affect its primary goal. And so the researchers were like, okay, let's make a second robot, and now let's make it consider other variables that might affect the outcome that we're trying to get. And then once they put this robot with this goal, basically the robot didn't go anywhere. It didn't move. And why is that the case? Well, then they check the robot's logs, and basically the robot was stuck in just computing possible scenarios forever. Because what you need to take into account is literally infinite. And basically you can never have possible resources to go all over. And so the robot can't do anything because it's first trying to think if all the possible scenarios are going to affect its main goal or not of battle. And so this is just some examples. It has to consider the outcomes of its own actions, the external factors, and it also has to consider everything that's irrelevant, which is the most important part. So here's some examples: color of the wagon, background noise level, solar flare, smell of the room, and so on and so forth. And there's two main problems with this. Problem number one it's very hard to know what's relevant. Like, I gave very obvious examples here, but if I made it a bit more ambiguous, you wouldn't even know what's relevant. And problem number two, even if you know what to detect what's relevant when you see it, you need to take it into account, which is precisely where the robot got stuck. In order to determine everything that's relevant, you need to take it into account. You need to compute it. And that's basically the entire universe, and you can't compute the entire universe because it's just too complicated and too large. And this can be explained in this equation, which is branching factor to depth of the game. I'll give an example so it's not too abstract. So let's say a game of chess, branching factor 30, that's the number of average plays that you can do in chess at any given time with legal moves. And then the depth of the game is the average of moves in any single game. And so with our equation, it's 30 to the power of 40, and it turns out that's a very, very big number. Okay? If you count all the grains of sands in the world, it's a lot bigger than that. And it's a lot bigger even if you had trillions of Earths. And then there's also the Shannon number, which is, instead of considering the average gameplay of chess, you consider all the possible configurations of chess, and that's even way bigger, 10 to the power of 120, and that's bigger than all the electrons in the universe, and that would be the case even if you have trillions of universes. And so you see why the robot gets stuck. And this is in the game of chess. Reality is way more complicated than a game of chess. Even this room is more complicated than a game of chess. You can analyze every single centimeter of the floor, every single possible configuration, every single possible scenario. So this is the one of the main problems of AI, which we're still trying to fix. And basically we can't, long story short, because it has this problem of relevance. We need to know what to focus on. Somehow humans are able to do this, but machines can't. We made some progress lately with machine learning, but not very much. And it's mostly by transferring our intelligence to the robot rather than making the robot intelligence from like the bottom up. So the important concept is affordances, made famous by Gibson. The affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes. An affordance is a relationship between an object and an environment, or an environment and an organism, that affords the opportunity for that organism to perform an action. So right now you're all sitting in chairs. That's because that chair is affordable to you, because it's a relationship between a human being and the chair. So it's an affordance, but it wouldn't be an affordance to a dolphin, because a dolphin can't make anything out of a chair, and human being in this room. So there's always a relationship that depends both on the agent, what the agent is capable of, and whatever the environment has. And a similar concept is optimal grip. This was explained by Ponti. He didn't call it optimal grip, but he kind of laid the foundations. And then Dreyfus, when interpreting Heidegger, he called it optimal grip. So he says here, for each object, as for each picture in an art gallery, there is an optimal distance from which it requires to be seen, a direction viewed from which it grants the most of itself. At a shorter or greater distance, we have merely a perception blurred through excess or deficiency. We therefore tend towards the maximal visibility and seek a better focus as with a microscope. So not only there's affordances in the world, but also you can negotiate that because you're an agent in the world, and you can seek the optimal level of interacting with something. So the example here of the art, of a picture in the art gallery is quite perfect, because you can't get too close, otherwise you won't see it, but also you can't be too far away, because otherwise you also won't understand what painting is about. And so, number one, there's an optimal distance, and number two, you can navigate that in the world. And some of these concepts, along with others, resulted in 4E cognitive science. 4E means that it's embedded, embodied, enactive, and extended. And long story short, it kind of it highlights the fact that we have a body and we're embodied agents in the world. And this was a competing framework to cognitive theories of minds, which basically try to argue that the mind is like a computer and that everything that we're doing is information processing, which is not quite true. And so based on all this work of cognitive science, there's this framework that I think is quite helpful by John Vervaeke. It basically says that there's 4 kinds of knowing: propositional knowing, procedural, perspectival, and participatory. Propositional knowledge is kind of the most basic form of knowledge. It's like there's a table over here. It's either true or false. It's based on my beliefs. That's all there is to it. When most people think about knowledge, this is what they think about. Then there's procedural knowing, and this is about skills. So knowing how to ride a bicycle isn't about propositional knowledge. Playing an instrument isn't propositional knowledge, right? You can't just say to students, this is how you play guitar or piano, and now they know. Like, they need to go through the thousands of hours in order to get good at it. And then there's perspectival knowing, which is encoded in episodic memory, and this has to do with states and affordances. So there's a perspective of what is it like to have a certain type of experience, and that gives you a certain type of knowledge. So for example, the concerts that you've been seeing and attending, there's something like to be in a concert and to listen to the experience, right? That's different than propositional knowledge, and it's also different than just a skill, right? It's the experience itself. And lastly, participatory knowing, which is related to the fact that you're an agent in the world, you can engage with the world, and you can negotiate with the world. So it's very related to the optimal grip that I was talking about. So lastly, when talking about reality, I've taken mostly a cognitive science approach, but also people have been thinking about what reality is within the discipline of philosophy since the beginning of time. Just going to give a few quick examples to understand some of the concepts that are on. One is Plato. So Plato had the theory of forms. So he basically argued that there's kind of this abstract realm where forms exist. And everyday reality of what you're seeing is kind of like imperfect versions of these eternal forms. So if I have a cup, there's an ideal form of a cup somewhere in some abstract realm. And that's how you recognize the cup, right? Because there's many different types of cups, and you all recognize it as a cup. And how do you do that? Exactly, they're all different. I can even make a completely new cup that you've never seen in your life, and you're like, that's a cup. Plato is like, well, that's because there's an ideal cupness to the cup, right? And also he had, and by the way, this might seem a bit silly. It seems very like anti-scientific, but it's actually not that simple, because if you think about, so there's like a spectrum of objectivity in science. So like psychology is a science, but it's not a very hard science, right? And so biology is a bit more objective, and physics is a bit more objective, and mathematics is a bit more objective. But then if you go to the mathematicians, a lot of mathematicians will be Platonists. And why is that? It's because they regard mathematics as real. And that's a very strange concept, because you don't see mathematics in the world. Mathematics is an abstraction. And so even if you go all the way as objective as you can, you're still kind of going to encounter this problem. And also, lastly, he also had the allegory of the cave, which you might have heard at some point. So it's basically a lot of the thinking of the forms, but also imbued with kind of some spirituality into it. So there's some prisoners in the cave. All they're seeing is shadows. These are kind of like the imperfections of the world. And then someone managed to escape the cave, and they see the light, they see the truth for the first time, which is kind of the eternal forms of Plato. And lastly, Aristotle, he thought that when you're trying to explain something, there's four causes to it. Number one, a material cause, which is what something is made out of. Then formal cause, which is basically the structure of it. So a cup has a formal cause of the cup, and also the material is made, for example, of glass. Then the efficient cause is who made the cup, right? So in our case, a machine, but back then, some artisan. And then the final cause, which we call the thelos of something, is why the cup was made. It has a certain purpose to it. And then also, he talked a lot about potentiality and actuality as core components of the world. So potentiality is something real at the bottom level of reality. It's just not just some imagination. And this will be pretty useful to consider. And when you think about these types of systems, like Plato and Aristotle, it might seem odds of how they view these things, and we think that now we have a better understanding. But we actually don't. It might seem anti-scientific, but that's largely because the worldview that we have now has been constructed by taking the subjectivity and taking consciousness out of the equation. And so kind of Galileo started this trend of like mechanizing the world. But when he did that, he diversed consciousness, but with the full awareness that consciousness was real, he just couldn't fit it into this new way of thinking about the world. But then as the centuries went on, we kind of forgot consciousness and we just conceptualized the world as just mechanical stuff. And lastly, another pretty useful thing to cover when talking about what reality is and the importance of the mind is the field of philosophy of mind. This is fascinating. I won't get into details because it would be too long, but long story short, you can't explain consciousness through science. And I'll just give a quote by Chalmers. Why is that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience, the quality of deep blue, the sensation of little sea? How can we explain why there is something like to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? We have no good explanation of why and how it arises. And this is called the hard problem of consciousness, and it's still unsolved to this day. You can give it a shot if you want to try to solve it, but it's pretty complicated. So, some recap so far. The world is made more than physical objects. Cognition and perception involves meaning, and reality is made out of patterns. So, now let's get a bit more religious. Cover the concept of transcendence. What transcendence means is surpassing something, going beyond. So I really love this painting, which I think is a good kind of a representation of what this might mean. It's the basis of religiosity. So there's some kind of claim that there's something like the transcendent and that you can get in touch with it in some form. And also transcendence has a very long history, but just to give a simplified account of it, you saw kind of some glimpses of this in Plato. So, you're trying to transcend, to contemplate the eternal forms. Then we also have Kant. Kant made this distinction between the thing in itself and your perception of it, and that there's an internal barrier between it. And that led to all kinds of developments in how we think about transcendence. One major one is that until Kant, philosophers were very obsessed about proving gods in a logical manner. And Kant basically said, you're wasting your time, this is absolutely impossible. Not in the sense that God doesn't exist, but in the sense that there's limits to your rationality, and you can't go beyond it. And then lastly, I have Otto and Iliad, which I think is another significant development in the history of the notion of transcendence, which is relatively modern scholars of religion that have tried to go back to religious traditions and try to explain what they were about, what transcendence means in a more secular manner. Because by then, this is like 20th century, because by then the notion of transcendence starts to become incoherent. People didn't really understand what that means. And so one of my claims is that music is very connected to transcendence, and I'll try to explain a little bit on what it is. So, what is music? That's a very complicated question. There's a lot of debate around it, but I would argue that music is patterns. So there's music playing, there's some kind of pattern going on, and also usually there's a lot of patterns at the same time, and usually throughout the piece, those patterns are connected to each other. And this seems very abstract, but I think it's quite reasonable. And also usually when people do try to give a definition of music, a lot of times what they come up with is organized sound. So if the sound isn't organized, that isn't music. And that's basically the same thing as saying music is patterns. Also, music is pretty unique in art, because a lot of art is representation. So these paintings are about something, right? This is about some house, some ruins, there's some trees. It's very straightforward. But what is music about? Especially instrumental music. It's very complicated to answer. It doesn't seem to be about anything in particular. And that's why I would argue that it's about everything. And I'll try to explain on why that is. I also think it reveals the structure of reality. And what I mean by here is kind of what I tried to mention in the first part of the inherent realness of meaning, that you don't live in the world of facts. If you live in the world of facts, you have the robot problem, and plenty of other problems. And so meaning and pattern is how you experience reality. And that's what music is. And you feel that right away. And it also resists reductionism. So like I mentioned, science kind of like trying to explain some phenomena away by a lower level. But in music, that seems to fall short. Like if I'm having an experience of listening to Bach and I'm really involved in it and I'm really contemplating its beauty, if someone says to me, oh, but that's just, vibrations in the air, I'm like, you're not really understanding the experience, and your definition of what's real is pretty stupid. And I think music is really the highlight that shows you why it's stupid, because it's so meaningful and so sacred, I would say. And also it highlights different forms of knowing. So there's procedural, which is kind of playing an instrument, like I mentioned, but also even if you don't play at all. There's perspectival knowing, so there's some perspective of having the experience of listening to music, and it feels very meaningful. And also there's participatory knowing. Even if you're not participating in the creation of the music, it always feels like it's calling out to you, so to participate on it. So when people listen to music, they very often feel compelled to like follow the beat and like tap their foot and whatnot. And I don't know if I'm the only one, I don't think so, but a lot of times when listening to classical music, I also get this sense of like, that I'm trying to conduct the music to appear and to shine forth. And obviously I don't know how to conduct, so I don't know what my brain is thinking, but I feel compelled to do that. It's like it's asking for my participation in some way. And also to understand music, I think it's pretty helpful to also understand what stories are. So I would say that stories are made out of meaning, and by stories I have a pretty wide concept of why that is. By story I kind of mean something happened, so try to keep it very broad in your mind. So for example, if you had some situation at work with one of your students, like they didn't practice enough or they said something stupid to you, and you go home and you complain about it to your partner, you're not going to mention the color of the shirt that the student was wearing. You're not going to describe everything that was on the table, and so on and so forth. So there was a bunch of facts, and then you abstract out something that was meaningful, and that's the story. And so you create a pattern out of it. And some patterns are more important than others, right? So there's a story of whatever the kids did at school with you, but also there's some other patterns that you also abstract out of the physical world that are more important, like marriage, for example, or having a child, or and so forth. And also, if you kind of think about it in that way, in terms of importance, if you kind of keep going up and up, you'll encounter sacred stories. And so I made this kind of diagram here to try to explain what this is a little bit in a graphical manner. So there's the world of facts. You don't live in the world of facts. They kind of are part of reality in some way. But how they appear to you is already through meaning. And then if you abstract that out, you can make patterns out of the meaning, which are stories. You can also make layers of stories. So you can think about like a low important story, like the example that I gave. But then also, if you go to the cinema, you watch something that is a bit that feels a bit more important because it's covering more eternal aspects of your existence, like courage, like death, like love, and that's why you find it meaningful. But then you can also even go further. You can go, for example, to great literature that has survived for centuries. Then you can go to fairy tales, then you can go to mythology, and then you can go to religious stories. And the higher up you go, the closer you are to the sacred. And I think there's 3 common threads between music and the sacred, which I'll try to explain. Ineffability, seeking completion, and inexhaustibility. Ineffability basically means that it's beyond words, so you can't really speak about music very easily. And likewise, throughout history, people have conceptualized the sacred of also being beyond words. William James, in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, says, not conceptual speech, but music rather, is the element through which we are best spoken by mystical truth. Many mystical scriptures are indeed little more than musical compositions. And then the second factor was this sense of completion and of wholeness. So in music, there's this idea of returning home, for example, but also even if you consider the piece more broadly, a lot of times there's this idea of you're finalizing the piece in some sense. There's nothing left unsaid. And in the sacred, there's also this idea of perfection and completion. And it's usually a previous state of some kind. So here's a depiction of the Garden of Eden, which is when humans were in communion with God, and they were complete before the fall. And I gave this example, which is a Christian one, but also, for example, even in Eastern traditions, you're trying to become an enlightened being, but some traditions have conceptualized that as also that you're looking for wholeness, but also the wholeness was always there in the first place. So like you're already enlightened, but you're just being clouded by deceptions, by desires, by attachments, by illusions, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, there's ineffability. So about 5 years ago, I decided to try to take classical music a bit more seriously. So I made this YouTube playlist of like 8 to 10 pieces. And my goal back then was I'm going to study these 8 to 10 pieces. I'm going to really understand them. And then once I do, I'll create another YouTube playlist of, again, 8 to 10 pieces. And then once I master that, I make another one. And after a few months, after a few years, I'll basically have a good understanding of the entire Western canon of classical music. That was my idea. The problem is, 5 years later, I'm still in the first playlist. That didn't go very well. And that's because I never felt like I truly understand those initial pieces. I felt like there's always something more that I can get out of them. They're inexhaustible. And in the sacred, there's also this idea popping out all the time. So here's a quote from Kierkegaard. I am convinced that if Mozart ever became completely comprehensible to me, he would then become completely incomprehensible. And this is a deep quote, and it kind of makes your brain feel funny, but what I think he means is that number one, it's beyond rationality, and number two, that the unexhaustibleness of it is part of its essence, it's part of its identity, of its definition, and therefore the whole thing kind of breaks if you violate that. And also from the sacred perspective, Simone Weil says, the value of mystics resides exclusively in their infinite capacity to furnish truths that may be grasped by anyone who contemplates them for a long time with a religious attention. So she's talking about the inexhaustibility, but also the fact that it's accessible to anyone if you have the right kind of attention. And also this pops up a lot in Taoism as well. The Tao that can be described is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be spoken is not the eternal name. And also the opposite of something sacred is something profane, and I think it might be tricky in our society to view music as sacred, and I think that's because of these 3 points. Number one, I think we see music as entertainment, something that's kind of fun and fairly casual, that just feels good. That's certainly not how a lot of people have thought about music throughout history. Also, I have here hearing but not listening. What I mean here is that hearing, I'm kind of defining it as something casual, and listening is kind of this attempt of like truly trying to understand it and exhaust it to the degree that you can. So for example, hearing might be, you're in a coffee shop and there's some music playing in the background, or it's the music of an advertisement or something. And listening would be like, you're sitting down and you're fully engaged with the music and trying to give it your whole soul to it. And lastly, I think it might be hard to understand the link between music and the sacred because we're not looking for the sacred. And we're not looking for the sacred because the sacred is not intelligible in a scientific worldview. And if it's not intelligible, you kind of don't take it seriously. And so a lot of people think sacred, religion, God, a bunch of propositional claims. Does God exist? Yes or no? And that's silly because there's no proof of God through science, therefore the sacred is completely irrelevant or meaningless or what have you. Now, I think that there's always some sacred in music, whether you are aware of it or not. And so I think that's one of the great things about music, is that it resists this scientificization of the world, but nevertheless it becomes harder to kind of pick up on it. And in relationship to the sacred and music, there's this concept of the music of the spheres. You might have heard of it. It was described by Pythagoras in the 6th century BC. He called it universal music. It was basically out of his discovery that music is connected to mathematics, and it had some ratios that you could calculate. And this was described because of the idea that the movements of celestial bodies have to make a movement, because things make a movement if they're very fast on Earth, so they figured this must be the case in heaven. So part of it was kind of like an attempt at early cosmology, but the other one was also a lot more philosophical, which is there's an order to the universe, and that order is musical, essentially. And it's a bit complicated to explain what that is, but part of it is that if you're trying to establish the order of something, it's a lot easier to do that when everything is constant. So the more variation and the more noise there is, the harder it is to figure out any order, which is why, for example, we have scientific experiments, which is you're trying to stabilize the environment in order to figure out an underlying cause. And the heavens have a lot less variation and randomness than on Earth. And so they look towards the heavens to try to figure out the patterns of the world and the patterns of the cosmos. And they thought that the cosmos was musical and that it was beautiful. And this is an idea that we really can't comprehend, but this was very, very influential and very obvious to the ancients. This lasted 2,000 years easily. Newton was still talking about this. Very, very long time after Pythagoras. And so, for example, the word cosmology comes from the word cosmos, and that's where we got the words cosmetics, for example. And what is cosmetics? Something that you apply to a phrase, for example, in order to not only to make it beautiful, but also to reveal its beauty, right? I can't put makeup in this table and now it's suddenly beautiful, right? But if it's on a human face, then it becomes beautiful. And people looked at the universe as beautiful. And also this music was silent, which is very interesting. So they conceptualize it as music, but it's not a music that you can hear, but it's a music that you can attune to your soul. The sages, for example, Pythagoras was able to attune himself to the music because he was considered kind of like a mystical sage back then. What is this sacred pattern? I would say it has three essence to it. Number one, it's fractal, meaning that you see it, first of all, that its pattern repeats on itself. So for example, a tree has a trunk and then it has a branch, but also on each branch it replicates that pattern. And so when you're thinking about sacred patterns, you see this a lot. The pattern replicates in itself, and also you see it on other places as well. So for example, the pattern of the tree, you also see it in other aspects of nature. It has universal utility, meaning that once you see it, you can apply it to other areas of your life. And also it has explanatory power, meaning that other things make sense once you think about it this way. And this is super abstract. Maybe with some examples you'll kind of figure out this better, but don't worry if you don't. Part of what I think the sacred is dealing with a fundamental duality in reality. So three major ways to help you think about this is heaven and earth, chaos and order, and yin and yang. Yin and yang is probably the easiest because people like exotic things from the Eastern world, and it doesn't feel so metaphysical, so people usually like this a lot, but it's basically the same thing. And there's also a bunch of other kind of dualities that I put on the side. I don't think those are all the same thing, but they're close enough. They have a lot of overlap, just to give you some other examples. And then I made this kind of hierarchy to try to help you understand how some of these things work. So we start at the very bottom, which is knowledge. Knowledge is propositions, as we kind of saw before. Then there's practical wisdom, which is like knowing how to act in the world. Then there's divine wisdom. Divine wisdom is a bit different. So practical wisdom is usually acquired from experience. But then divine wisdom is usually conceptualized as something out there that you attune yourself to it. You kind of get in tune with it. And it's usually not about the particular situation, but it's usually about your whole being. It's transforming yourself. It's about overcoming self-deception. It's about looking at the entire world very differently. Then we have Enlightenment, and Enlightenment is easier to understand if I cover logos as well. Logos is a complicated word, has a lot of meanings depending on the context, but the way I'm using it here is that it's basically the in-betweenness of this duality. So it's the mediator between heaven and earth, chaos and order, yin and yang. And you can think about logos as a spirit, and if you fully embody the spirit, then that's what we usually mean by enlightenment. And it might sound very weird to think about spirits and stuff like that. So one way to think about it is, let's imagine that you can conceptualize an abstract version of what a perfect musician is, or a perfect piece being played abstractly. And then there's a given player that's playing that piece. And you can think that to the degree of how well that player is playing the piece is dependent on how much they embody the spirit of the perfect play. You can also think it in Platonic terms, maybe that helps a little bit. I don't think this is what logos is, but it's to help you understand this idea of like trying to embody something that's abstract. And if you understand that, it will help you a lot. So on the left, we have a painting by Blake representing Jacob's Ladder, a biblical story. He was probably also having some influences by Dante, because Blake loved Dante. He learned Italian just so that he could read Italian, even though the English translations were already available. And it's basically the ascension of a human, in the biblical story Jacob, in Dante's himself, basically going up the ladder until the highest of the highs, kind of heaven, let's say, which, by the way, is music at the very top. So in Dante, when he's ascending all these levels, what he finds at the top is music. It's the music of the spheres, played by harp, if I remember correctly. And also on the right, you can see a Buddhist depiction of the Pure Lands, which also has this kind of vertical hierarchy element to it. It also has this element of also center and periphery. These are basically the same thing, kind of a vertical hierarchy or a centering of something. It's kind of the same symbolism, they just display differently. And so on the left, this is a modern depiction of a famous story in Buddhism. And basically, Buddha has this disciple, which is a musician, and he was struggling with his spiritual progress, so he asked Buddha for advice. And Buddha asked him, what happens if the strings of your instrument are too tight? And he said, then they will break. And then Buddha asks, what if they're too loose? Then they won't produce any sound. And then Buddha says, to try to help him with this problem, is that the answer is the middle way. Right? So you can't go too much to either extreme. And this is not an isolated case. The middle way is a core component of all Buddhism. And on the right, you have a Byzantine icon of Christ. This is one of the oldest we have. You can see that on the right side, you have his hand up. This symbolizes forgiveness. It symbolizes compassion. But on the other hand, you see the book of Gospels. And what that symbolizes is judgment. Because on the book, basically spells out how you should act and how you should be. And you're less than what you could be, that is stated on the book. And therefore, there's a gap. There's a gap between what you are and what you could be according to those standards. And the symbolism here is that Christ is the perfect mediator between judgment and compassion. And this is a very easy thing to understand because you have to try to embody this role when you're a parent. Right? So when you're a parent, you have to be compassionate towards your child and forgiving, but also you have to be a judge. And you have to find a trade-off somehow. And so the notion of enlightenment is very universal. It's not specific to any given tradition. Usually it's a bit more as heavier associations with Eastern traditions, but long story short, this happens in tons of traditions. Not saying they're all necessarily the same, but the overlap is very, very big. And also when I talk about this duality, a lot of it might seem very abstract, so I want to give you a few examples if you go to the level of practicalism. So when I was a kid, I was always very interested when my parents and my grandparents would kind of give traditional sayings when a situation happened and they wanted to give some advice or they wanted to highlight something. And I noticed that sometimes those sayings are contradictory, which was very weird to me because if you're giving advice, you're telling how to act, but if there's contradictory advice, then that seems kind of pointless. And so I have some examples here. Look before you leap. He who hesitates is lost. Think twice before you act. Strike while the iron is hot. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Out of sight, out of mind. And basically, what these sayings do is that they highlight different aspects in somewhat isolation. So individuality versus conformity, optimism versus realism, change versus consistency, risk versus certainty, and so on and so forth. And the answer isn't any of them. It's context dependent, right? And that's what's so tricky about it, is that there is no right answer. There's just trade-offs, and you have to find the right balance for a particular situation. And so you can see how this relates to cognitive grip as well, of trying to find a particular balance, because affordances and cognitive grip, they're not just about objects, because we already figured out that reality isn't about objects. So this affects everything. And so you can think about the idea of logos as the perfect spiritual optimal grip on the world. Very big mouthful and some oversimplifications, but that helps you understand it. And there's also some dualities in music. I'm not trying to reduce music to just this, but if you take these away, it'll be pretty hard to make any music. So tension and release, dissonance and consonance, silence and sound, predictability and novelty. And also, since we're speaking about duality, you might also like to know that your actual brain is divided in two. So you have two hemispheres, and they're divided by the corpus callosum, which is kind of some thick fibers that run across your brain like this. And it manages the communication between hemispheres, and they're pretty well separated. Like generally speaking, only about 3% of fibers in your brain actually cross all the way to the other side. And when talking about hemispheric differences, there's a lot of myths and a lot of misinformation, but this is based on the work of Ian McGilchrist, which has a pretty good interpretation of the evidence, and I'm trying to summarize his work here. So and basically, your left and right hemispheres perform slightly different functions. So local communication versus cross-communication, representational versus embodied, local attention, global attention, explicit language, symbolic language, predictability compared to exploration, novelty, and then detail focus compared to gestalt focus. And gestalt means when the sum is greater than its parts and when a pattern emerges. For example, the cows, if you didn't see them before. And basically his whole thesis is that our society has been obsessed by how the left hemisphere looks at the world. I don't have time to explain that properly, but you can look up on your time if you like this type of thinking. But the right hemisphere is very important because it's about relations, and music is about exclusively relations. And basically, the right hemisphere is what allows the worlds to be alive in the same way that music is alive. And it's always context dependent. So even the very etymology of intelligence, it's two words mixed together, which is inter and leggere, if I know how to pronounce that correctly in Latin, which means kind of reading between the lines. So if you remember this duality, kind of like the intelligent person, the wise person, is the one that knows exactly where to go right in between two things that often are opposite of each other. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about insight. Insight is required for problem solving. So if you're trying to solve a problem, when you eventually figure it out, you have a flash of insight. It's kind of like a light bulb going into your brain. It feels very meaningful, it feels rewarding, and it requires breaking the frame. So usually when you have an insight, usually when you have a problem, you were interpreting the problem incorrectly. And when you have an insight, you kind of change your frame. It's like, oh, now it makes sense. And then you get it. And when you have insight, there's a process of differentiation and integration as you're trying to solve the problem. So the way to think about it is that if you think about the problem and there's several components, you're trying to break things apart as much as you can, and you're trying to zoom in. And also with integration, you're doing the exact opposite. So you're zooming out and you're trying to clump things together. And as we talked about different levels of reality, different levels of abstraction, you can think of that what your brain is trying to do is your brain is trying to go through all the possible options of all the possible configurations, and it's playing with this as much as it can in order to find an adequate frame in order to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And John Vervaeke has this very helpful framework called the Cognitive Continuum, which basically says that insight, flow, mystical experiences, and transformative experiences all have the same cognitive machinery. We already talked about insight. Flow, you're probably familiar with. It's kind of like the state of being in the zone. It's probably very familiar to musicians. Also happens a lot in sports. You kind of lose your sense of ego, and it feels very meaningful. It feels very effortless. And it's a combination between your skill and the demands of the task. So if it's too easy, then you can't get into a state of flow, and if it's too hard, you can't get near. It has to be the perfect amount. And then with the mystical experience, just like flow can be thought of as a cascade of insight, you can think about mystical experience as an intensification of flow. So not only do you feel your ego reducing, but also your ego just completely goes out the window. And it also feels very, very meaningful. In fact, most people report that it's one of the most meaningful experiences of their life. The same thing as getting married or watching their firstborn child be born. And also, then we have transformative experiences, which is a subset of mystical experiences. And so when people have a mystical experience, a lot of times they completely, radically change their life, and they completely, radically change how they see the world, but also not always, and therefore there's kind of a small distinction there. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about psychedelics. Why are psychedelics relevant? Number one, because we talked about mystical experiences, and that's important because it has connections with insight, and has connections with sacredness. And mystical experiences are spontaneous, and they're kind of random, somewhat. So they're very hard to study, but psychedelics, you can just give psychedelics to someone and they have a mystical experience. So it's very useful for scientific purposes. It also breaks the frame that you're in. That's usually the benefit that people get from psychedelics. So for example, on that image there, you might have seen it, it's quite famous. On the left side, basically the outer ring means all the areas of your brain, and the lines means the connections. That's your sober, normal consciousness. And on the right is under psychedelics. This particular study was on psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms. And basically, everything is talking to each other, and this is what seems to allow this break of frame. So I've been very interested in psychedelics, and I've been accompanying the literature for about 10 years. It was also the topic of my master's in neuroscience. I did a review of psychedelics, psychedelic-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression. And so, as we've seen with insight, there's kind of this level of differentiation and unification, and psychedelics seem to operate with the same machinery. And also, I think it's important because it leads to transformational experiences, so people seem to find important enough that they change their whole lives because of it. In case you're not very familiar with mystical experiences, usually there's a questionnaire that's used often in studies called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. It's 30 questions, but it's roughly based on 6 overall themes. Transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood, experience of truth and reality at a fundamental level, sense of sacredness, experience of profound unity with all that exists, and ineffability. And there's this really cool study about connectum harmonics. I didn't have a lot of time to go into the methodology of it, but long story short, they take some fairly standard measurements in neuroscience, and then they apply some very fancy, some very complicated math in order to get the bottom right, which is, the authors kind of speak about it as kind of like a representation of brain activity as if they were notes. And so what they did is they took some of the concepts in interpreting harmonics in the sense of physics, and they tried to apply it to the brain. Not in a literal sense, because your brain doesn't vibrate in this way, but it was kind of like an analogy for them of a different way of interpreting patterns in the brain. And what they did was basically they gave LSD to some subjects, and they wanted to see, with this measurement, let's find out what happens. And here's what happens. So you can see on the top, let's see, increases total power and energy of brain activity, and on the bottom, it also increases high frequency brain states. So it's a very interesting study. They also had a group where they had music and another control without music, and music also seemed to have a greater effect on some of these measures. But the most important finding is that psychedelics seem to lead to structured reorganization of brain dynamics towards criticality. And what does criticality mean? Criticality is a theoretical construct of the perfect, well, the perfect criticality is theoretical, but you can certainly get criticality in practice, which is what happened here. And so it's a balance between order and chaos. And so when I was talking about order and chaos before, it was very theological, didn't seem scientific, but this is a purely mathematical construct. There's nothing shady going on here. And what it means is basically, in a system, usually a system has to fight two conditions, which is stability and flexibility. And usually you have one or the other. But if you have one or the other, then you have the flaws of not having the other. And therefore you have to find a trade-off. And criticality is the perfect balance of those two things. It's the brain's optimal grip on everything. That's what we need to think about it. And why is this important? Well, it's important because it's correlated with the subjective experience in the study itself. You can see that on the top. And also from other studies, not this one, we also know that it's correlated with therapeutic effects because psychedelics are used to treat mental health. So for example, on the bottom, you can see that it has really high correlation of the more intense the mystical experiences, the better the results for people to stop smoking, to overcome depression, to overcome anxiety. And also people have improved meaning in life, and they have improved quality of life. So, long story short, what I've been trying to say is music embodies the deepest structures of reality, and it also manifests the sacred in direct experience. The problem with these things is that they're very vague and very abstract, so if I just told you these two sentences right off the bat, you'd have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. And now, maybe you're still in the same condition, but if you're slightly better, then I achieved my goal. Hopefully you understand what I'm trying to convey here. And as you can see, it took us quite a while to get here, so it's very complicated. But a great thing about art is that it seems to compress and encapsulate a lot of really, really complicated stuff. And then it presents it to you, and you can get the benefits out of it, and sometimes understand it, even if it's at an implicit level, and you're able to benefit from it. And that includes music. And I think that's part of what makes art so valuable. And that also applies to symbols, which are somewhat related to art, and also applies to cultural frameworks. But long story short, human beings have been trying to grasp at these problems for a very, very long time. And just because we can't easily put it in scientific terms all the time, at least in a very simple way, that doesn't mean that they're real. And I think music is a pretty good example that forces you to reconsider what's real if you don't want to encounter all the problems that I mentioned before. And so Schopenhauer has this great quote: "Music is an unconscious exercise in metaphysics in which the mind does not know that it's philosophizing." And all of this was a bit theoretical, even though I presented some science, it was still within a theoretical framework. But now I also want to give a kind of a brief historical overview and present the case that this is not just me coming up to this connection. This has been kind of present since the beginning of time. So in shamanism and paganism, shamans act as bridges between worlds, between the natural world and the spiritual world. And drumming, dancing, and chanting are used in that process, and they're used as a gateway to altered states of consciousness. And also music is seen as a way of restoring health and restoring spirit, and those things were more or less the same back then. Also in Judaism, music is central to worship and community life. There's the cantillation of the Torah texts, so they actually sing it, it's not just spoken out loud. There's also the Nigun musical prayer, which is very mystical, and it's kind of improvisational, and it's very, very old. And so overall music is just used to enhance the spiritual experience and all the ceremonies around. So here's a quote from Rabbi Sachs. Judaism is a religion of words, and yet whenever the language of Judaism aspires to the spiritual, it modulates into song, as if the words themselves seek escape from the gravitational pull of finite meanings. Music speaks to something deeper than the mind. And then in Christianity, hopefully this is a bit more familiar to you because you're embedded into a Christian culture, but we have the traditional sacred music, which here are loosely defined as chants and hymns. Gregorian chants are the most obvious and well known. There's all kinds of chants. And then eventually kind of the organ started to be incorporated a lot, and then different musical styles were developed. And now I'm kind of simplifying a little bit, saying we peaked with Baroque, kind of with Bach and Vivaldi. And then we also have the classical period, and the classical period is worth highlighting because it kind of starts this trend in music where music is seen more so as an aesthetic experience rather than a direct reflection of some religious system. So this is people like Mozart and Beethoven. But I'll argue that even that is very mystical and very religious, because even if they weren't trying to tie it super directly with the Christian faith, they were still trying to aim for transcendent beauty. And that's pretty religious, whether you like it or not. And Beethoven famously says that music is a higher revelation than all of philosophy and all of wisdom. Then Sufism is a branch of Islam. Islam has a complicated relationship with music, but if you listen to their daily prayer, it's already pretty musical. But either way, Sufism kind of takes music and its connection to the spiritual as deep as they possibly can. It's used as a way to get closer to God, and they have this Sama ceremony. Sama means listening, as a door for spiritual ecstasy. You can see that on the picture. You might have seen videos of it on YouTube. They just kind of dance around and they go in circles, and it's quite beautiful. And then in Hinduism, it's the most musical of religious traditions. They have the concept of Nada Braham, which basically means that divinity is sound itself. And also they have this core concept of the Om, which is this primordial sound at the core of existence. So yogis, as they're training and trying to get enlightened, they would kind of try to close their ears with their fingers to try to get as silent as possible. And if they practiced long enough, and if they meditated and did yoga and so forth, they would eventually listen to these primordial sounds, which would probably make the connection with music of the spheres in the West. So, in her book, The Case for God, Armstrong says, even though human beings do not think about Brahman, they had intimations of it in the hymns of the Rig Veda. When the priest chanted the Vedic hymns, the music filled the air and entered the consciousness of the congregation, so that they felt surrounded by and infused with divinity. These hymns did not speak of the doctrines that the faithful were obliged to believe, but referred to the old myths in an elusive, riddling fashion, because the truth they were trying to convey could not be contained in a neatly logical presentation. And in Buddhism, it depends largely on which branch of Buddhism you're looking at, but in Tibetan Buddhism, there's certainly a lot of music in our sense of the words. In Zen Buddhism, it's usually a bit more minimalistic with bells and so on, but on broad strokes, chanting is used as a form of meditation and teaching, and also used in a lot of religious rituals. And here I have a quote from a sutta where Buddha has died, and then it says, heavenly music played in the sky in honor of the realized one, and heavenly choirs sang in the sky in honor of the realized one. So that was the lecture. Just to give some context, there's very limited nuance that I spoke here, so every slide that I've given you, that's basically the lecture in itself, and there's a lot of limitations and a lot of counter arguments for what I'm saying, but I obviously don't have the time to cover everything. Also, a lot of these things are subjective frameworks. So for example, when I did the triangle of facts to the sacred, that's just me trying to present this in a way that's easy to understand, but there's nothing inherently objective about this, obviously. And also, even though I spoke against reductionism, reductionism is sometimes unavoidable. So I spoke about the sacred and duality, but I don't think that the sacred is exhaustible in the concept of duality. Same thing about enlightenment and wisdom. And also, obviously, this is just my personal angle from my own experience, my own philosophy, my own education. And so people would look at the history and the science and the philosophy and come up probably with different conclusions. And also, I have some kind of bias in how I approach the topic in general, given that I'm fairly romantic in how I approach it, romantic in the philosophical sense, and also I'm very mystical on how I approach it. So other people would have different biases and approach it from a different way. I think this topic is important for everyone, obviously, because it deals with the sacred, and the sacred deals with what's important in life. But also I think this is particularly important for musicians, because obviously I'm drawing the connection with music. And I know that I didn't speak a lot about music, but that's because, number one, music is hard to speak about, like I mentioned, and also I hope that with all the background that I said, that the little that I said about music is that much profound and that much more understandable. But I also think that it's particularly relevant to teachers of music, because a lot of people think when they enroll someone in a music school, they probably view it as just another hobby of the kids, just like playing soccer or whatever. And I certainly think it's a lot bigger than that, because part of my argument is that I think music is a gateway to the sacred, and the sacred, by definition, is the most important thing there is, and therefore teachers are basically helping to cultivate and helping to develop something that's going to massively impact their life. It's going to impact everyone around the child eventually as they grow up. And so even though it sounds super cheesy, I legitimately believe that you're helping to make the world a better place by cultivating this in children. And so just to end up, to finish off the talk, I've been influenced by a variety of people. I just want to give a shout out to a few of them. The most important two have been Jonathan Pajot and John Vervaeke, and I was fortunate enough to have them on my podcast. But beyond that, I was also influenced by Ian McGilchrist, Iliad, Jung, and Heidegger. And so, just to conclude, reality is more than physical objects. I hope you understand a little bit about what sacred means, and also the relationship between the sacred and music. And that's it. Thank you very much.